Hello students, in this video we are going to discuss chief characteristics of the poetry of William Collins. So we start up with the Collins as lyricist. Collins was undoubtedly the most exquisite and great lyric poet of 18th century. There is singing quality in his poetry. On subject of fancy and flight of imagination, which is without a parallel elsewhere in his age. His poetry is personal and subjective, with which is lyrical in character, and his inspiration and his subjects of worthy feelings are his own experience, thoughts and feelings. His poetry is self delineation and creative self expressions. The language and imaginary employed by him are characterized not only by a subtle sense of beauty, mystery, and vividness, but also by harmony and unity unity of expression created by a single subject matter. In his Ode to Evening, his flight of imagination has displayed an outburst of emotions of joy as the deity, the nymph reserved, which is coming down to the earth. In these lines, whose number stealing through the darkening veil may not unseemly with its stillness suits the journal loved return. This ode is admittedly considered to be one of the most successful lyric. Without rhyme in English literature, it is more like a lyrical panacea, so change into a musical invocation to nymph reserved. Another quality of Collins' poetry is simplicity. Collins' mastery of melody's verse is almost unsurpassed in his age, though there is often a veneer of classicism in the style and manner of expression. In his early poet, in his early poet, there is a refreshing absence of affection in his odes. He had the supreme gift of simplicity combined with the kind and the obscure dignity, which are characteristic features of Greek poetry, and he invariably followed the style and the manner of true classicism, not the pseudo classicism of French authors of the age. It is the hunger of simplicity that give his poetry a grace, beauty, and freshness of its own. It seems in his own Ode to Simplicity, which characterizes his hunkering after the elemental simplicity. He conveys his thought as of these let other ask to aid some mighty task. The Ode of the Collins reveal the first authentic expression of dialectic and imitate poetic vision and lyrical strains in English poetry. He revived the romantic mood after a long slumber since the time of Dryden for many years. Thus, he had an instinct of elemental simplicity of life. Third, chief feature of his poetry is a typical poetic artist. Hence, we can say that Colin can be presented or may be presented as a typical poetic artist. In spite of his somewhat laboured vocabulary and conceit of the classicism, his poetry is on the whole full of purple patches, fallacious word, and the phrase inductive of weird cadence and subtly disposed music. These qualities, considered as a true forerunner of Romantic poetry, it was greatly to his credit that even though served by mental disease and young in years, he was able to fuse the harmonies all the phases of the pre-Romanticism in the Romantic spirit. He carried on his mission with consequential changes in theme, length, temper of verse, simplicity of phrase, language of nature, dominance of emotion, passions and imagination, in the place of dry intellectuality and didacticism of the classical school. He reacted against and established formed sought interest in medievalism and in the vanished glories of past. He envisaged diversion to strange and supernatural and exotic elegant note, a sort of renaissance of wonder and mystery. His style is reminiscent of Milton, sponsors of Shakespeare. He is a poetic artist of high order. Each phrase is imbibed with finished approach and wonder of fallacy workmanship without emphasis and without sense of strain. Four major characteristics of William Collins' poetry is he can be considered as poet of nature. Collins, as poet of nature, went a step further than his contemporaries, Thomas and Gray. He invested natural objects and events with a distinct personality and feeling tone of their own. He does use the personification and abstraction in conventional manner of the school of words. He turns his personification not as an intellectual counter but as the symbol of state of mind. His expression for nature suggests a kind of affinity between poet and nature. The sense of return of nature seek picturesque declination of nature in her melancholic or pensive moods. Like Wordsworth, Colin believed that the people who lived close to nature and were bred in an atmosphere removed from the vitiating influence of modern civilization lived more simple, innocent, and happy life than the throne dwelled. This is the note which struck in his Highland Ode. But oh, all forgot not the kinder rates, on whose black rocks which brave the vasting heights, fair nature, daughter, Versailles yet abide. He loved his love of art and beauty, love of the wild, fantastic supernatural. Colin was pictorial artist, a lover of music and all other forms of arts. His ode of passion describes the strange power of music with personification of each passion. presented in its natural moods, portrays the pose's equality melody as of harmonious smoothness, as of same divine. The ode to evening is again a typical instance of Collins as a painter poet. The verse is intently the whole communicative with figure like hermit hue of old Chinese painting of grave and moon and symbolically wild bird. He regrets vanish the glories of the pagan in the ode to the passion. He painted the way to so-called eclectic revival in English literature. In his Highland Ode, he had a great love for supernatural world. As a result of the combined effect fall these features of his poetry, Carl stands as a typical figure among the contemporaries. His imagination and subject matter carried a vital impact out he covering generation of the great romantics like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley in English literature. Few of the few of his characteristics are such as love towards classicism. The classical traits or the formal elements are the common property of pre-romantic poetry. Colin, which are much too prominent in his early poetry, was inclined towards the classical traits in his poetry. Next feature is simplicity and lyricism. He chose simple themes and tried to break away from the terminals of the artificial poetic diction of the age. His position as the best lyric poet of the age is unchangeable. His lyricism was the greatest contribution to the Romantic movement. Elegiac inspiration, the element of melancholy arising out of the circumstances, and his sarcastic and ill-balanced temperament reflect his elegiac inspiration in his poetry. Return towards nature, his live his works are alive with the feeling of the true nature worshipper. He wrote on the subject of the fancy and flights of imagination. His Ode to Evening is essentially a nature lyric romantic in subject, treatment and style in spite of outside veneer of classicism. Supernaturalism and the interest in sponge and remote. His poetry has marked characteristics of supernatural elements touching upon the medieval imaginary and ancient Greek concept. He enjoyed describing the popular superstitions of the Highland of Scotland. His poetry is also filled with the atmosphere of melancholy. There is note of melancholic feelings and so created an atmosphere in all his work. He arises out of a spontaneous sensibility such as elegiac notes could be seen in his The Passion on the Ode to Music, where in the melancholy is the happiest passion, so is the feeling in the ode on the death of Mr. Thompson.